The ground was cold and hard in Calhoun County that November. 5 men had been working since morning, and the particular smell of freshly turned earth in late autumn, that damp mineral smell that carries the season's last warmth, already leaving it, had been with them through the whole of the working day. Their tools made the sounds that tools make in quiet rural places, the clean resistance of a spade breaking ground, the softer sound of earth moved to the side, boots finding purchase on uneven turf. The trees around the cemetery had given up most of their leaves by then. The canopy, that would have been dense and full just weeks before, had thinned to a tracery of bare branches against a pale sky, each trunk and limb standing out in the particular clarity that West Virginia hillside woodland takes on in mid-November, when the season strips everything back to its actual structure and nothing is hidden anymore. The cemetery sat in a fold of the Appalachian foothills in the way that many rural West Virginia burial grounds do, tucked into a clearing made available by the particular arrangement of the terrain, with dense woodland pressing close on multiple sides, and the feeling of being held by the landscape rather than simply placed on it. Calhoun County is not a large county, and the roads connecting its communities follow the contours of the hills rather than asserting themselves against them, winding through hollows and along ridgelines with the practical patience of routes that were established long before machinery made the ground negotiable. The burial ground near Clendenin sat within this kind of country, an ordinary piece of ground that 5 working men had been attending to with the unhurried, methodical care of people doing a practical job on an ordinary day. Nothing about the morning had been unusual. A burial detail in rural West Virginia in 1966 was a matter of physical work done by people who knew how to do it, and the 5 men working that day would have moved through their task with the comfortable efficiency of repetition, talking the way people talk when work has its own rhythm and conversation fills the spaces between efforts without demanding attention. The cold kept them moving. The bare trees stood at the cemetery's edge in the still air. The pale November sky sat above the tree line without drama, offering the particular undifferentiated gray-white light of a November day that has decided against both sun and rain and settled instead for a kind of ambient flatness that makes distances hard to judge. The tree line was close on the downhill side of the cemetery. The Appalachian foothills have this quality that what appears to be a reasonable distance in flat country becomes much shorter when the land falls away, and the edge of a woodland that looks 100 yards off can resolve into 30 when the slope drops between the observer and the trees. 5 men with their feet on the ground, their attention on work at hand, their awareness of the surrounding landscape, the ordinary half-conscious background, awareness of people outdoors. They would have known the tree line was there, the way anyone knows a thing they are not actively looking at. It occupied the periphery of the afternoon, the way the cold occupied it, as a fact of the environment rather than an object of attention. What they saw rose from the upper part of that tree line. That detail matters, and it is the detail that the men return to consistently in their accounts, not that the figure came from the ground or dropped from somewhere above, but that it rose from the trees themselves, lifting away from the canopy with what the witnesses described as a smooth, untroubled ascent. The treetops in that part of Calhoun County, with their foliage gone, reached perhaps 60 or 70 feet in their tallest specimens, and the shape that left them was by every account the 5 men gave, large enough to register against the pale sky in a way that a crow or a hawk or any of the birds that actually lived in those hills could not have done. It was the scale of it that resolved the five men's attention from work to sky. Scale is the first thing that does not match, and it was the first thing they noticed. The body of the figure was large and dark against the pale sky. The wings, and every one of the five accounts used the word wings, independently and without coaching, were enormous. In the framing that every witness offered, the wingspan was the element that made the figure's size concrete, because wings have a familiar proportional logic, and the logic of these wings belonged to nothing any of the five men had encountered before in those hills. Large birds are known in West Virginia. The great blue heron, whose wingspan reaches 6 feet, is a common enough sight along the waterways of the Appalachian region, and the turkey vulture, with its 5-foot span and its characteristic rocking glide, is a familiar presence over any rural area in the state. Figure the five men described had wings that went beyond either of these by a measure that all five of them registered as significant, each in their own language, each arriving at the same conclusion by a different route. The ascent itself was what separated the figure from every large bird they knew. A great blue heron lifting from a tree line moves with effort. The great slow wing beats of a heron departing are among the more visible exertions in the familiar bird world, each stroke visibly working against gravity, the long neck folding back, the legs trailing, the whole departure, a staged negotiation between the bird's size and the air's willingness to hold it. Turkey vultures are different. They are masters of thermals and can hang in the air with almost no movement at all, but their takeoffs from a perch are awkward, a brief scramble into the wind before the soaring takes over. What the five men described was neither of these things. The figure rose without effort. It lifted from the upper canopy in a smooth, continuing ascent that required, as best as the witnesses could describe, very little labored movement. The wings were open and enormous, and the figure simply went upward, with the unhurried steadiness of something that was accustomed to the air and had no particular argument with gravity. The eyes were red. This is the detail that all five men reported, and it is the detail that has persisted most stubbornly through every subsequent account and every later record. Not merely dark, not merely catching the ambient light in some way that might be attributed to natural eyeshine in certain birds. The accounts agreed that the eyes were self-luminous, that they gave off their own red light rather than reflecting something else. Owls and many other nocturnal animals produce a phenomenon called eyeshine, in which a layer of reflective cells behind the retina bounces ambient light back toward the observer, producing the familiar greenish or reddish glow that a flashlight beam reveals in a cat or a deer in darkness. But it was afternoon. The pale November sky provided a diffuse, even light with no particular source for reflection. The men described the eyes as producing their own light, large and red and visible at a distance that eyeshine alone would not account for. That detail appears in every account. It is the thread that runs through all five memories of the same moment. 5 separate memories of the same moment is itself something worth dwelling on for a moment. Collective sightings are complicated in the way that any human testimony is complicated. Memory is a reconstruction rather than a recording, and people who witness an unusual event together will inevitably influence each other's recall, the accounts shaping one another in the retelling before any formal record is made. That contamination of memory is real and well documented, and it is one of the reasons that independent accounts of the same event are valued more highly than accounts gathered in a group, where social dynamics can push individual recollections toward a shared narrative. But the Clendenin sighting had 5 witnesses, 5 people looking upward at the same pale sky, at the same moment, each processing what they saw through their own perceptual equipment, their own prior experience of the world, their own language for things. When 5 separate accounts agree on scale, on the quality of the ascent, on the presence and character of the red eyes, that agreement sits in the historical record with a weight that a single account does not have. It does not resolve the question of what was there. It does not explain the thing. It simply makes the sighting more difficult to reduce to a single person's error of perception, a single misidentification, a single moment of ambiguity that one person resolved in one direction. The men watched the figure until it was gone. The accounts do not specify how long that took. The natural assumption, given the figure's apparently effortless ascent, is that it moved quickly enough that the interval between first sighting and disappearance was not long, a matter of seconds rather than minutes. But the quality of attention that 5 working men bring to an unexpected aerial figure is different from the quality of attention they were giving to the earth a moment before. When something unusual registers in the peripheral field and the full attention of 5 people swings toward it, the perceptual clock changes its pace. The moment stretches. What the 5 men saw, they saw with the particular sharpened attention that comes when the ordinary collapses briefly and is replaced by something the mind does not immediately have a category for. Then it was gone. The tree line was still. The pale sky continued in its undramatic way. The cold was the same cold. The opened earth of the burial site was still there waiting. What the 5 men did in the immediate aftermath, whether they spoke, whether they stood in silence, whether one of them named what they had seen before, the others did, the record does not say. What the record carries is the outline of what they all agreed, later, that they had witnessed: a large, winged, man-like figure with enormous red eyes rising from the upper canopy of a Calhoun County tree line on the afternoon of November 12th, 1966, carrying itself upward without apparent effort and disappearing from sight. The drive back toward Clendenin would have taken the familiar rural route, the wooded road moving through the kind of landscape that is so consistently itself: ridgelines, hollows, bare-limbed woodland, the occasional farmstead set back from the road, that it offers nothing to interrupt whatever a person is carrying in their mind. The men had something new in the cab with them on that drive. It was not the kind of thing that fit into any familiar conversation. The Appalachian landscape in November has a quality of settled oldness, a sense of a terrain that has been there since before anyone arrived to name it, and will be there long after, and driving through it with an experience that does not have a category, yet produces a particular kind of quiet. 5 men, who had shared a strange afternoon, moving through familiar country, carrying something they did not yet have words for. The area around Clendenin and through Calhoun County, more broadly, had the characteristics of much of rural West Virginia in the mid-1960s. Small communities connected by winding roads, a close awareness of neighbors and local events, and the particular speed at which news moved through a community where people knew each other well. An unusual report in Calhoun County in 1966 would have moved through conversation before it reached print. The 5 men would have told people. People would have told other people. By the time the account reached local newspaper attention, it had already moved through the informal network that carried information in small rural communities, a network that was fast for local matters and slower for anything requiring the formality of a published record. The newspaper account that resulted was modest. The editors of local West Virginia papers in November 1966 received the Clendenin Cemetery report with the calibrated skepticism of journalists covering regional news, which is to say they noted it, they printed a version of it, and they moved on. a regional curiosity. An unusual account from 5 working men who reported something large and winged above a rural cemetery. The story occupied the middle range of the local news hierarchy, more interesting than a county council meeting, less pressing than a court case, and it was treated accordingly. A paragraph or two, names perhaps, or perhaps not. The details as the men had reported them, rendered in the matter-of-fact language that small-town journalism applied to items it did not know quite how to categorize. The coverage it received was in proportion to what it appeared to be at the time, a single isolated account of something odd, seen by 5 people in a rural West Virginia county, reported once and then filed in the daily accumulation of local news. There was no framework in November of 1966 to suggest that the cemetery sighting near Clendenin was the first entry in a sequence that would continue for 13 months. No one reading the modest newspaper account could have known that 3 days later, on November 15th, a different set of witnesses in a different part of the state would report an encounter with something very similar, and that those accounts would draw the national press attention that this one had not. The Clendenin sighting sat quietly in its modest newspaper column, a factual note about something unusual, waiting for the context that would eventually arrive to surround it. What the 5 men described did not change in the retelling. The consistent core of the account, the scale, the effortless ascent, the red eyes, remained intact across the versions that reached print and the versions that persisted through local knowledge. This is a feature of the Clendenin sighting that is easy to pass over in moving toward the more widely reported events that followed, but it carries its own weight. Consistent accounts from multiple independent witnesses do not resolve into an explanation simply by being consistent. Consistency is not proof of anything except that the witnesses agree, but consistency is information. 5 people agreeing on the same details, arriving at those details from their own perceptions, not coordinating their descriptions in advance, carries more evidentiary weight than 5 people who were told what to say. The 5 men near Clendenin had no obvious reason to fabricate an account, no framework of prior legend to borrow from, no organized community of believers to report to. They reported what they reported to the local newspaper and to the people around them, and the account they gave was consistent, and that is where it sits in the historical record. The landscape around the cemetery has not changed fundamentally in the decades since November of 1966. The Appalachian foothills of Calhoun County are still there in their characteristic configuration of ridges and hollows, their woodland still standing in the layered depth that makes the West Virginia hills what they are. The bare canopy in November still resolving into that particular tracery of branches against a pale sky that the 5 men would have known their whole lives. The cemetery is still there. Burial grounds in rural West Virginia are persistent things, marked on topographic maps and tended by the communities around them across generations, and the ground that 5 working men were attending to on November 12, 1966, is still the ground that it was. The tree line from which a large winged figure rose that afternoon is still a tree line, still standing in its position at the edge of the clearing, still doing the ordinary work of woodland on the slopes of the Appalachian foothills in West Virginia. The 5 men who saw the figure have moved on through the decades in the ways that people do. Their account has not. It persists in the early newspaper coverage of the broader events that November began, in the notes of the researchers who eventually compiled the record of those 13 months, in the local knowledge of Calhoun County that has carried the story alongside the broader legend it preceded. The sighting near Clendenin is typically mentioned in most accounts of the larger sequence as a kind of prologue, a first data point that precedes the more extensively documented encounters to follow, and that was only recognized as a first entry in a sequence after the sequence had developed enough to have a recognizable shape. At the time, on November 12th, it was simply an account of something unusual seen by 5 people doing their work on a cold afternoon. The particular form of the burial detail as a mode of labor is worth holding for a moment because it matters to the texture of the account. Gravediggers are working people doing practical work in a specific environment, and that environment, a rural cemetery, quiet, enclosed by woodland, attended to with the physical and attentive engagement of manual labor, produces a specific quality of presence. People doing physical work outdoors develop a particular relationship with the environment around them, the ground underfoot, the air temperature, the light conditions, the sounds of birds and wind, and the tools they are using. Their attention is not the abstracted attention of someone lost in thought. It is grounded in the physical particulars of where they are and what they are doing, which means that when something in that physical environment changes and registers as unusual, the noticing of it is coming from a quality of attention that is already present and already engaged. 5 men working a burial detail in a rural cemetery are not the kind of witnesses who confuse something obvious for something strange. They are the kind of witnesses who know their environment well enough to recognize when it has produced something that does not belong to its usual inventory. That quality of attention is part of what gives the Clendenin sighting its particular texture in the record. These were not people in an ambiguous state of perception, tired, frightened, primed by prior accounts, seeking something unusual in an environment that was already unusual to them. They were people doing familiar work in familiar landscape on an ordinary afternoon, and something unfamiliar rose from the familiar tree line above them, and they saw it with the clear-eyed, grounded attention of people who were already in their bodies and already paying attention to the world around them. The 5 accounts agree on what they saw: the red eyes, the enormous wings, the smooth, effortless ascent, the size that exceeded any known bird of the region by a significant margin, 5 sets of eyes, 5 separate registrations of the same ascending shape, against the same pale sky. In the days and weeks after November 12th, the modest newspaper coverage of the Clendenin account sat in the flat geography of ordinary local reporting, neither developing nor disappearing. A community of 600 or 700 people, a rural county in the West Virginia hills, a working day account of something seen in the sky above a burial ground. The report had no sequel, as far as anyone in Calhoun County could yet tell. It was not part of a pattern. It was simply itself an account of something unusual, seen by 5 people, reported once, filed. The tree line from which the figure had risen was the same tree line it had always been. The bare November branches continued their patient indifference to what may or may not have moved through the air above them. 3 days later, the county seat of Mason County, West Virginia, some distance to the south, would become the location of a different set of accounts, and those accounts would draw the kind of attention that the Clendenin sighting had not. National newspapers, wire services, the particular machine of mid-1960s American journalism, which could take an unusual story from a small town and move it across the country in days. When that happened, when the Mason County accounts began to accumulate, and the pattern of a larger sequence became visible, journalists and researchers began to look backward through the record for earlier data points. And there, in the modest coverage of the local Calhoun County paper, was the cemetery sighting. 5 men, November 12th, large winged figure, red eyes, smooth ascent, 3 days before the Mason County encounters that would eventually define the legend's name and give it its national profile. The retroactive reframing of the Clendenin sighting as a first chapter is interesting precisely because it was not recognized as a first chapter at the time. The 5 men did not know they had seen something that would eventually be understood as the opening observation in a 13-month sequence. The editor who took the report by telephone and made a note about it did not know the note would eventually sit in a press archive as one of the earliest documented accounts in a story that would still be discussed and examined decades later. The process by which an isolated, modestly reported regional account becomes, in retrospect, the opening entry of a larger record is one of the quieter features of how significant events are actually documented. They do not arrive with their significance already attached to them. They arrive as what they are, single moments, reported by people who were present, noted by people who received the reports, filed in the ordinary way that all reports are filed, and left to wait for whatever context will eventually arrive to give them their place in a larger account. The note made about the Clendenin sighting, whether it was a few lines in a reporter's notebook, a typewritten paragraph in the day's copy, a telephone record in a newsroom filing system, was a modest object. It recorded 5 names, a location, a date, and a description that had no precedent in the local record, and no obvious successor at the moment it was written. The editor or reporter who made it was doing their job, which is to say they were receiving an account of something that had happened in their coverage area, and noting it with the standard tools of journalistic record keeping: what happened, where, when, who was there. The note was true to what had been reported, which was the 5 men's account of what they had seen, which was itself true to what 5 pairs of eyes had registered above the tree line of a Calhoun County cemetery on a cold November afternoon. That note sits somewhere in the record now, or did at one time, in a filing cabinet, in a microfilm archive, in the collections of a researcher who found it while tracing the chronology of the larger sequence. It is the kind of object that does not ask for attention. It is the kind of object that receives attention only when someone knows to look for it, when the larger story has developed enough to create a reason to reach back and find the beginning. The beginning for this story was 5 men in a rural cemetery looking upward into a November sky, seeing something large and red-eyed and smoothly ascending above the bare tree line. They reported it. Someone wrote it down. The account entered the record in the modest, particular way that true accounts enter records, without announcement, without the significance it would later carry already attached to it, and waited in the flat, patient way that documents wait for the rest of the story to arrive. The Appalachian Hills of Calhoun County continued in their November way after the 5 men drove back toward town. The cemetery returned to the quiet that rural cemeteries maintain in the hours and days between the visits of the living. The tree line stood in its undisturbed depth, its bare upper canopy against the pale sky, its lower reaches already settling into the particular dimness of a West Virginia hillside woodland as the short November afternoon gave way to evening. Whatever had risen from those trees that afternoon was gone. The sky was empty in the way that skies are empty, which is to say, full of ordinary things, wind and light, and the passage of known birds between known places, and the extraordinary thing, if that is what it was, had moved on to wherever it was going. And a small note, made about that afternoon, was filed in the ordinary way. The Ohio River and the Kanawha River meet at the edge of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, in the particular unhurried way that 2 wide bodies of water find each other, not with force or turbulence, but with a slow lateral folding, one current easing into the other until the boundary between them becomes a matter more of geography than of any visible distinction in the water itself. Standing on the bank where the confluence happens, the Ohio stretches west and north toward the far green line of the opposite shore, broad and pewter-colored in the flat light of an ordinary afternoon, moving with the steady indifferent pull of a river that has been making that same journey toward the Mississippi for longer than anyone has kept records of it. The Kanawha arrives from the southeast, narrower and darker, carrying the particular quality of water that has come a long distance through forested hill country before it found its way to this point. The town takes its name from what happens at that bank, Point Pleasant, a name given by the surveyor George Washington in 1770 when he passed through on a land survey and noted the particular appeal of the location in his journal, the confluence, the flat ground, the long sight lines, the rivers opened between the hills. The town that grew at that confluence over the following 2 centuries was a modest, steady one. It did not grow into a city. It did not shrink into a hamlet. It found a size approximately 6,000 people by the middle of the 1960s and held it with the particular stability of a place that has a clear reason to exist and does not require more than that. The Ohio River had always been the reason. River trade had built the earliest structures, given the town its commercial bones, and the bridge that eventually crossed the Ohio at Point Pleasant made the town a crossing point as well as a destination, connecting the West Virginia bank to the Ohio side and folding the town into the grid of regional movement that kept small places alive in the years before interstate highways reorganized everything. Mason County spread out behind the town in the particular Appalachian manner, rolling, forested, cut through with narrow creek hollows and gravel roads that connected small communities to one another and to the river town at their center. Main Street in Point Pleasant in 1966 had the comfortable, worn quality of a street that has been looked at every day for so long that it has become invisible to the people who use it. The storefronts were familiar. The faces in them were familiar. There were churches, several of them, representing the variety of Protestant denominations that had settled the Ohio Valley over 150 years, and schools, and a courthouse, and the particular network of civic organizations, clubs, and community gatherings that gave small American towns in the 1960s their strong lateral social fabric. People knew one another's names in Point Pleasant. They knew which families had been there for generations and which had arrived more recently. Unusual news traveled quickly, not because people were particularly gossipy, but because the town was small enough that the ordinary channels of conversation, a phone call, a conversation at the hardware store, a word after church, could carry a piece of information to a substantial portion of the population within a day or two. That quality of the town, its connectedness, its social density, the high baseline of trust between people who had known each other for years, would matter later when accounts of unusual things began to circulate. The credibility people extended to their neighbors' reports was not credulity. It was the ordinary social confidence of a community where most people had known most other people long enough to have a working sense of who was reliable, before anything strange attached itself to Point Pleasant, before any story about the town had spread beyond Mason County. The place held one particular distinction that its residents carried with quiet civic pride. On October 10th, 1774, at the point of land where the Kanawha meets the Ohio-Virginia militia forces under Colonel Andrew Lewis, fought a sustained engagement against a confederacy of Shawnee and Mingo warriors led by the Shawnee chief Cornstalk. The battle lasted most of a day. Losses were significant on both sides. When it was over, the Virginia militia held the ground, and the Confederacy withdrew across the Ohio River, and the engagement opened the way for the colonists' westward expansion into the Ohio Valley. Some historians have argued with reasonable support that the Battle of Point Pleasant was in practical terms the first military engagement of what would become the American Revolutionary War, fought 2 years before the formal Declaration of Independence, and driven by many of the same tensions about land, governance, and the limits of colonial authority that would eventually produce the Revolution itself. The historical marker commemorating the battle stood in a park near the confluence, and Point Pleasant's residents passed it so regularly that it had become part of the landscape's furniture in the way that deep history always becomes, present, acknowledged, no longer remarkable simply by virtue of its presence, but available as a source of quiet identity for anyone who thought about it. That quality of deep time embedded in ordinary ground was not unusual for the region. The Appalachian Ohio Valley had accumulated several different kinds of history in the same relatively compact stretch of landscape, and Point Pleasant held more layers than most places its size. The river history, the battle, the industrial development of the early 20th century, and then, on several thousand acres of land north of town, the particular history that the federal government had written into the landscape during World War II and then walked away from. The facility was built beginning in 1942, when the United States Army needed a site for the production and storage of explosives on a large scale and found what they needed in the flat, relatively remote land north of Point Pleasant. The construction was substantial. Several thousand acres were fenced, roads were built, and across the landscape a series of storage structures were erected, low, rounded, dome-shaped concrete buildings that looked from a distance like the humped backs of some large buried animal, each one designed to contain a quantity of explosive material safely separated from its neighbors. The structures were called igloos by the workers who built them and by everyone who came after. There were hundreds of them. They were built of thick, poured concrete, their curved walls engineered to direct any accidental detonation upward and away from adjacent structures, their interiors cool and dim and smelling of mineral damp regardless of the season outside. The facility produced and stored TNT during the war years, which gave the area its lasting local name, the TNT area, plain and descriptive, the kind of name that a community gives a place when it needs to refer to it, often enough that something short and clear is necessary. When the war ended, the calculus of the facility changed. The urgency that had built it evaporated, the production wound down, and the Army found itself in possession of several thousand acres of contaminated, infrastructure-heavy land that it no longer required. The igloos were emptied. The roads began to deteriorate. The fencing stayed up in places and fell in others. The federal government eventually transferred the land to the state of West Virginia, and the state designated it the McClintock Wildlife Management Area, a nature reserve and hunting ground that made use of the land's isolation and its woodland borders, while doing little to alter the physical landscape the wartime facility had left behind. The igloos remained, too solid to demolish cheaply and too numerous to repurpose. They stood in their overgrown fields as the decades passed, the scrub growth advancing around them, small trees taking root in the gravel of the old service roads, the thick curved walls still perfectly intact under the lichen and the weather stains. By the 1960s, the TNT area had the quality of a landscape that has been occupied for a purpose, and then released, the structures still speaking the language of their original function, but surrounded by nature that has been quietly reclaiming the ground between them. What the TNT area offered to Point Pleasant's teenagers in the mid 1960s was exactly what abandoned places have always offered to young people anywhere: remoteness, darkness, and the particular freedom of a landscape that has been officially forgotten. The paved roads that connected the old facility to Route 62 were still navigable by car. The area was far enough from the center of town to be out of sight, close enough to reach on an ordinary evening. On weekend nights, cars would pull off the road at the edge of the McClintock area, headlights sweeping across the overgrown asphalt before they were cut, and groups of teenagers would sit in the dark with the particular combination of mild nervousness and mild boredom that defines the experience of being young in a small town with a car and nowhere specific to be. The concrete igloos stood at various distances from the road, half visible in the dark, their rounded shapes breaking up the tree line in a way that was recognizable as man-made, but foreign enough in its scale and its stillness to be reliably unsettling. The old generator building, a larger concrete structure at the center of the facility, where the electrical infrastructure for the wartime operation had been housed, sat in a clearing near the main road, its windows long since emptied and its roof intact, a reference point for anyone navigating the area at night. The teenagers who went there in those years were not, for the most part, doing anything unusual. They were doing what teenagers do in remote places after dark, which is to say very little, and mostly they went home afterward without anything worth mentioning. The Ohio River continued its particular business throughout all of this. From the Point Pleasant bank, the far shore of Ohio was visible as a low, dark line across a wide expanse of moving water, close enough to make the crossing feel navigable, far enough to give the river its proper sense of scale. The Silver Bridge, which connected Point Pleasant to Gallipolis, Ohio, crossed the river roughly at the confluence, its aluminum-painted cables catching light in a way that made the structure identifiable from a considerable distance on clear days. The bridge had been completed in 1928 and had been carrying traffic across the Ohio for nearly 40 years. By the mid-1960s, familiar enough to the people who used it daily that they had probably stopped seeing it in any conscious way. It was part of the geography, as unremarkable as the river it crossed, as routine as the morning commute of the people who drove over it to their jobs on the Ohio side. The sound of traffic on the bridge's metal deck was part of Point Pleasant's ambient background, a low, periodic rumble that arrived and faded with the crossing vehicles, and was noticed only in its absence, which was to say almost never. The rivers themselves moved through everything, but they had been there before the town, and before the battle, and before the road that brought the first settlers to the bank, and their quality of long lateral continuity gave the landscape its particular sense of ground. The Ohio moved north and west in its unhurried way, carrying the water of dozens of tributaries toward its eventual meeting with the Mississippi, and the Kanawha arrived from the southeast with its cargo of highland water and slid into the larger current with the ease of something that has been doing the same thing for a very long time. At the confluence, in the particular quiet of a weekday afternoon, with no boats on the water and the bridge traffic reduced to its midday minimum, the sound of the two currents finding each other was the primary sound, and it was not dramatic, and it was not small, and it had the quality of a sound that does not require anything from the listener except that they be still enough to hear it. The hills behind the town were Appalachian hills, which is to say, old hills, worn down from what were once much greater elevations by a very long period of time into the particular rounded forested shapes that characterize that landscape. Not dramatic peaks, not flat plains, but a repeated undulation of ridge and hollow that closes off the long view and gives any position within it a feeling of being cradled without being enclosed. The forest on those hills in November was bare, the hardwoods stripped of their leaves, and the tree lines against the November sky had that particular skeletal quality, individual branches, legible against gray light, the density of the canopy reduced to a tracery of dark lines, the visual texture of the landscape altered entirely from its summer density to something more open and more stark. The light in November in that part of West Virginia had a specific quality too, flat and pale, arriving from a low angle even at midday, giving the landscape a quality of being perpetually in late afternoon, the shadows long and the colors muted, the whole scene carrying the particular restfulness of a place that has released its summer brightness and settled into its winter patience. The community that Point Pleasant sustained in those years had the close-grained quality of places where the same families have been doing the same things for long enough that the routines have become invisible. Church attendance was high. The schools were known to the adults who had attended them as children. The local newspaper, the Point Pleasant Register, covered town council meetings and high school sports, and the ordinary business of civic life with the consistency of a publication that knows exactly who its readers are and what they need to know about their town. The Mason County Sheriff's Department was a small operation by any urban standard, staffed by people who knew the county as intimately as they knew their own properties, every road, every property owner, every place where teenagers were likely to park on Friday nights. That institutional familiarity with the local landscape and its people was not a limitation. It was the thing that made the department an effective source of information about what was happening in the county, and it was the reason that when people in Point Pleasant experienced something they could not account for, the sheriff's department was a credible and accessible place to report it. The physical landscape of the TNT area had one additional quality worth noting, which was the sound of it. The McClintock Wildlife Management Area, reclaimed by state authority and left largely to its own ecological recovery, had accumulated a substantial wildlife population in the decades since the wartime facility had been emptied. Great horned owls lived in the mature trees at the area's margins. Red-tailed hawks hunted the overgrown fields between the igloo rows. White-tailed deer moved through the scrub growth at dusk in considerable numbers, pausing in the open areas between the bunkers before retreating into the heavier woodland at the edge of the reserve. The animals that had moved into the area after the human activity stopped had done so with the thoroughness that wildlife typically achieves when given sufficient time and sufficient isolation, and by the mid-1960s the TNT area was, ecologically speaking, a genuinely productive and varied habitat operating under the thin disguise of an abandoned industrial facility. The concrete of the igloos had cracked in places, and in the cracks small trees had taken root, their roots working the old aggregate apart in the patient way that roots do. The interior spaces of the structures, cool and undisturbed, served as denning sites for various mammals and as roost sites for a variety of bat species, whose evening departures from the igloo interiors could produce a remarkable visual effect in the dusk hours. A dark, flowing mass emerging from the curved entrance of a concrete dome, dispersing into the failing light above the overgrown field with the casual, effortless quality of something that has been doing this every evening for years and is entirely at ease with the performance. The roads through the TNT area were in the condition that unmaintained paved surfaces achieve after 15 or 20 years of deferred care, still recognizable as roads, still navigable by a careful driver, but increasingly colonized by the grass and the seedlings pushing up through the cracked asphalt at the road's edges. The center crown still relatively clear, the shoulders merging gradually into the surrounding vegetation. At night, those roads had no artificial illumination of any kind. The nearest streetlights were back in town, several miles south, and the darkness of the TNT area on an overcast night was the genuine deep, unmediated darkness of a rural landscape without power, the kind of darkness in which the eyes reach for detail and find none, which shapes, at any distance beyond the immediate foreground, become ambiguous, in which the mind applies its considerable interpretive apparatus to stimuli that are genuinely insufficient to support confident identification. That was not a unique quality of the TNT area. It was the quality of any rural landscape at night, anywhere in the country, in that period before the proliferation of security lighting and the general brightening of the rural night that came with rural electrification's later phases. But the TNT area's particular combination of human-made structures, the igloos, the generator building, the deteriorating road network, overlaid on a reclaimed natural landscape, created a visual environment that was unusual in its specific way, familiar enough to be recognizable as man-made, and strange enough, especially in low light, to be disorienting. Point Pleasant's particular position in the geography of the region gave it a specific relationship to the communities that surrounded it. It was the largest town in Mason County, which made it the commercial and institutional center for a dispersed rural population spread across the county's hills and hollows. People drove into Point Pleasant for the hardware store, the pharmacy, the county courthouse, the hospital. They came in for church on Sundays and for school during the week, and for the particular social commerce of a regional center that a smaller community simply could not provide for itself. That influx of surrounding population into the town and back out again on a regular rhythm meant that news from the surrounding county moved into Point Pleasant with considerable efficiency. People brought their experiences and observations with them when they came to town, and the accounts circulated through the same social channels that carried any other information. The high school functioned as one of the most efficient of those channels, drawing together young people from across the county into a single institution where information traveled with the speed that boredom and sociability combined to produce. The Kanawha River, arriving from the southeast, had its own character distinct from the Ohio's broad, deliberate movement. It was narrower, slightly faster in its feel, and the water it carried had the particular dark clarity of highland streams, not murky, but deep in color, taking its tonal quality from the tannins of the forested watershed it had drained on its way down from the interior of West Virginia. Where the Kanawha met the Ohio at Point Pleasant, the two water colors were briefly distinguishable before the larger current absorbed the smaller one, and in the right light, at the right time of year, this color differential was visible from the bank as a diagonal line in the water, a seam between the two river characters that held for a short distance downstream before dissolving completely. The people who had lived beside that confluence for their whole lives had likely stopped noticing it. The seam between the rivers was part of the background of the place, as unremarkable as the hills, as constant as the sound of the current, as present as the bridge on its aluminum-painted chains. The munitions facility that had occupied the TNT area during the war years had left other marks on the landscape beyond the physical structures. The soil in portions of the area retained contamination from the wartime production processes, not at levels that produced immediate obvious effects, but at levels that complicated any thought of returning the land to agricultural use and contributed to the decision to designate the area as a wildlife management station, rather than to develop it for other purposes. The contamination was invisible in the way that chemical contamination is usually invisible. No change in the color of the soil, no die-off of vegetation apparent to the casual observer, the landscape superficially indistinguishable from any other overgrown former industrial site in the region. The ecological recovery of the area had proceeded despite the contamination, plants and animals adapting to what they found in the soil with the particular pragmatism of organisms that do not have the luxury of choosing their environments. The result was a landscape that was simultaneously a functional wildlife habitat, a contaminated brownfield, and a collection of intact mid-century military infrastructure, all occupying the same several thousand acres, with a layered quality that no single description fully captured. Autumn in Mason County arrived with a particular decisiveness. The hardwood forests that covered the hills went from their full summer density to bare branches in a matter of weeks, the yellow and orange and rust of the turning leaves giving way to gray and brown with a speed that felt, after the long, slow summer, almost abrupt. By mid-November, the trees were stripped, the landscape had contracted into its winter configuration, and the pale, flat light of the Ohio Valley November had settled over the hills and the river and the town at the confluence with its characteristic quality of patient, unhurried stillness. The days were short, the afternoons darkened early, the distance between dusk and full darkness was brief enough that the transition from the last usable light of the day to genuine night happened almost before it could be fully registered. The concrete igloos standing in their overgrown fields north of town held the cold of the season in their thick walls and gave it back slowly over the course of each day, their interiors maintaining a temperature several degrees below the ambient air outside. They were built to last, built to contain explosive material safely, built by a government with resources and a specific engineering mandate, built of a material whose characteristic quality is endurance. The walls were 2.5 feet thick in some structures, poured in the no-nonsense manner of wartime construction that prioritized function over economy and expected to be permanent. 2 decades after the wartime facility had been emptied, the igloos were as structurally sound as the day they had been completed. The forest had grown up around them, the asphalt roads had deteriorated between them, the weeds had seeded in every available crack, and the igloos had simply waited with the patience of large concrete objects, indifferent to the passage of time in the way that only genuinely durable things can be. Point Pleasant itself, in the ordinary autumn of 1966, was going about its business with no particular sense of anything unusual impending. The school year was underway. The churches were holding their regular services. The sheriff's department was managing the county's routine concerns. The Point Pleasant Register was covering local news with the steady, unglamorous consistency of a community newspaper that knows its job is to document the ordinary life of a specific place for the specific people who live there. The Silver Bridge was carrying its daily traffic, commuters, delivery trucks, families making the crossing for various ordinary reasons, with the routine reliability of a structure that has been doing the same thing for nearly 40 years and has given no one any reason to think about it except as a means of getting from one bank to the other. The Ohio moved beneath it. The Kanawha arrived from the southeast. The hills stood in their late November bareness on all sides. The concrete bunkers waited in their fields north of town, surrounded by their overgrown landscape, housing their bats and their small animals, and the patient seasonal life of a place that has been given back to the wild without any formal ceremony of return. The TNT area's abandoned concrete bunkers stand in those overgrown fields, still, heavy, curved, intact, the thick walls unchanged from their wartime construction, the forest having grown considerably denser around them in the decades since the mid-1960s. The McClintock Wildlife Management Area continues its quiet work of sheltering the species that moved into the landscape after the human activity ended. The same ecological processes that were underway in 1966, continuing with the unhurried consistency of natural systems that are not dependent on any human attention for their continuation. The Kanawha still arrives from the southeast. The Ohio still carries its wide, pale expanse west toward the Mississippi. At the confluence, if the afternoon light is right and the river traffic is quiet, the seam between the two watercolors is still briefly visible before the current absorbs it, a diagonal line in the water, a meeting place, a point where two different things find each other and become, without ceremony or announcement, one. The old generator building in the TNT area stood in the dark, the way abandoned structures do, not threatening, exactly, but present in the particular way that things left behind by human activity tend to be present, which is to say, more heavily than expected for something no longer in use. The concrete was poured decades before that November night. The machinery inside had long since gone quiet. The surrounding land, once the working interior of a wartime munitions operation, had spent 20 years growing back over itself, and by 1966, the scrub in the second growth woodland had made significant progress. It was cold. The date was November 15th, 1966, and the night around the abandoned building had the specific quality of a rural West Virginia November, still air, bare branches, the kind of darkness that comes from being genuinely far from city light. Roger and Linda Scarberry and Steve and Mary Mallet were two young married couples who knew each other the way people in small river towns know each other, which is thoroughly and without much ceremony. They were in their early 20s. They had driven out to the TNT area together, as many Point Pleasant residents had done over the years, because the abandoned munitions grounds north of town had a quality to them that made people curious. The overgrown roads, the concrete bunkers, half disappeared into their own surrounding vegetation, the general atmosphere of a landscape that had once served a serious purpose and had been left to its own devices since. It was a Friday night in November, and they were in a car together, and the generator building was just ahead. What they saw, standing near that building, was described the following morning in terms that were straightforward and largely consistent between all four of them. The figure was large. It stood upright. Its eyes, in the darkness near the building, produced a quality of light that the witnesses described as red and self-generated, not reflecting the headlights of the car, but rather glowing with their own source. The wings, folded at first, were enormous relative to the body that carried them. All four of them were in agreement on these details. When the figure moved, the Scarberry vehicle moved too, and at considerable speed. Roger Scarberry later described driving away from the TNT area at well over 100 miles per hour on the rural roads that led back toward Point Pleasant, and the figure, he said, kept pace. It flew above and behind the car. Its wing movement, he noted, was not the kind of labored beating that large birds produce, not the effort of a heron or a great blue wing working against resistance, but something more efficient and less obvious, a straight-line movement with minimal visible exertion, covering ground faster than the car beneath it. Mary Mallet, seated in the back, described the same quality of flight. Steve Mallet described the same red light. Linda Scarberry described the same gray coloring to the body, the same enormous folded wings before they opened. By the time the car reached town, all four of them had arrived at the same instinct, which was to report what they had seen. That same night, the Mason County Sheriff's Department received them and took their accounts. A deputy named Millard Halstead, by most reports, was the one who recorded the statements. What he noted was the consistency between the four accounts, the fact that the two couples described the same figure with the same features, and the fact that neither couple appeared to have had the time or opportunity to coordinate their descriptions before speaking separately. The statements went into a file, the file went into a cabinet, and within a day, the account was moving through Point Pleasant in the way that unusual news moves through a small town, which is thoroughly and faster than anyone plans for. The Mason County Sheriff's Department had not, before November 15th, received reports of this particular kind. The county had its ordinary range of incidents, traffic matters, disputes, the ordinary domestic business of a rural jurisdiction in the mid-1960s. What it did not have was an established category for four credible adult witnesses who had just signed consistent statements describing an upright, winged, red-eyed figure flying at highway speed above a rural road. The deputy filed the report. The word went out, and by the following morning, the local newspaper was involved. The Point Pleasant Register ran the account. The story was specific: four named witnesses, a location, a time, a description consistent enough to be recorded faithfully, and within a short period of days, it had reached the Associated Press wire. From the wire it moved outward in the way wire stories do, picked up by papers large and small across the region, and what had been a local account with local witnesses began to acquire a wider attention that the county sheriff's office had not prepared for. The phone calls that followed were not from skeptics, or not primarily from skeptics. They were from other people who had seen something or who believed someone they knew had seen something and who had not previously found a reason to report it. The weeks that followed are best understood as an accumulation. This is the honest structural fact of what happened in Mason County between November 15th and the end of December 1966. Not a single dramatic event, but a slow, consistent gathering of accounts, each one individually modest, the collection of them producing something harder to set aside than any single report would have been on its own. The figure described in these accounts was, with a consistency that investigators noted, essentially the same figure the Scarberrys and Mallets had described. Large, upright, wings folded at rest, opened in flight, eyes that produced red light without appearing to need a source for it, gray or dark brown coloration to the body, varying slightly in the telling, but not substantially. The core description held. Mary Heyer was the Point Pleasant correspondent for The Messenger, a newspaper published out of Athens, Ohio. She was a working journalist with a local beat, which is to say, she was paid to pay attention to what happened in and around Point Pleasant, to cultivate sources, to receive calls from the public, and to determine what was worth writing down and what was not. By temperament, she was methodical. By training, she was skeptical in the practical way that working journalists tend to be skeptical, not dismissive, but unwilling to report what she hadn't verified, and careful about what verification meant in any given case. She had been covering Point Pleasant for years, and she knew the town well enough to have an opinion about who was reliable and who was not. What began coming across her desk in the weeks after the Scarberry-Millett report was not, by the standards of her beat, easily categorized. The callers were not obviously confused or credulous. Some of them were people she knew. Some of them were people she had dealt with professionally and found trustworthy. The descriptions they offered were not dramatically inconsistent. They were, with variations in circumstance and geography, pointing at the same general image. She wrote things down. She asked for specific details, dates, locations, what time the sun had set, where the witness was standing, which direction the figure had been moving, she noted the answers. The notes accumulated over days, then weeks, and the pile of them on her desk began to represent something that was not easily explained away by individual credibility problems, because the individual credibility problems were in shorter supply than might have been expected. This is worth dwelling on for a moment, not to assert a conclusion, but to notice the character of the evidentiary situation Heyer was accumulating. The canonical problem with unusual sightings is that the accounts tend to vary significantly, that witnesses describe incompatible details, that memory and expectation and social reinforcement do visible work on the story until what the first person saw and what the 10th person describes are genuinely different things. What Heyer's notes reflected, at least through November and into December of 1966, was something that did not behave that way. The accounts came from different people at different times in different locations around the TNT area and the county's rural roads, and they held their shape in the particulars, the coloring, the eyes, the scale of the wings, the unusual quality of the flight, with a consistency that was at minimum worth noting as a data point, regardless of what interpretation it was supposed to support. The TNT area itself remained the geographic center of the sightings during this period. This was partly because it was where the Scarberry mallet encounter had occurred, and the location was now fixed in the public mind as the relevant one, but the clustering of subsequent reports around the same territory was also consistent with how the area looked and felt at night. The overgrown former industrial landscape, the bunkers sitting in their overgrown clearings, the old roads running through second-growth forest, the general quality of a place that had accumulated several different kinds of disuse. People who went to the TNT area in the weeks after November 15th were in some cases going to look for what the Scarberries and Mallets had seen. Some of them found nothing at all, which is what the great majority of people who go looking for unusual things find. Others came back with accounts that added, in their specifics, to the pile of notes on Mary Heyer's desk. The Mason County Sheriff's Department maintained its own record during this period, and it is the character of that record that constitutes perhaps the most grounded feature of the entire 13-month sequence. Law enforcement has practical reasons to be skeptical of unusual reports. The investment of time and resources, the reputational considerations, the basic institutional conservatism of organizations responsible for public order. Deputy Halstead and his colleagues were not, by available accounts, credulous men looking for an excuse to take the reports seriously. They were local officers dealing with a volume of calls that the normal operations of their department had not prepared them for. The fact that the department's file of Mothman-related reports continued to grow through November and December without a summary dismissal of the incoming accounts reflects something about the quality of what was coming in, the specificity, the consistency, the absence of obvious fraud or confusion as an explanation that would close the matter. Each new account in that file arrived on its own sheet of paper, a name, a date, a location somewhere in the county's rural geography, a description of what the witness had seen, taken by an officer who had reasons to ask hard questions, and who asked them. The answers went down in writing. The stack grew. By mid-December, the file had accumulated enough material that it was itself a kind of document, not of what the creature was or where it came from, but of something specific and real, the recorded experience of a community over a defined period of time, held in the format of official report, sitting in a county law enforcement archive in a river town in West Virginia. Somewhere in the weeks that accumulated through November and into December, the accounts began to shade in their circumstances. Not all the sightings were in the TNT area. Some were from people driving county roads elsewhere, people who had not been to the TNT area and had no particular reason to be thinking about what the Scarberries had described. A report from someone outside the primary geographic cluster, describing features consistent with the reports from inside it, was a different kind of data point, the kind that was harder to account for through the mechanism of expectation. The idea that people see what they have been told to look for in places where they have been told to look for it. These outlying accounts were noted. They were added to the file. The cold of December settled over Mason County in the usual way, which is to say steadily and without ceremony. The bare tree lines along the Ohio and Kanawha rivers, going from late autumn brown to the specific gray of a West Virginia December, the river itself taking on its winter quality, wide, flat, moving with the patient indifference of water that has been making this particular run for a very long time. Point Pleasant went about its business. Christmas shopping was in progress at the town's modest commercial center. The Silver Bridge carried its ordinary traffic across the Ohio River, as it had since 1928, aluminum-painted spans familiar to everyone who had grown up in the county, a piece of infrastructure so ordinary in its daily presence that no one thought particularly about it when they drove across it. In the days leading up to December 15th, a small number of witnesses placed the Mothman figure in the vicinity of the bridge. These accounts were noted at the time, added to the file, given the weight that any account in the accumulating record was given, modest, documented, held in suspension without a determined conclusion. The reports were not alarming in themselves, not treated with particular alarm when they came in. A figure near the bridge, described in the familiar terms, noted, filed, added to the stack. The nature of what those accounts would come to mean, in the light of what happened on December 15th, is a question that the record does not answer. The accounts existed before the collapse. They were contemporaneous documents. What it means that a figure described consistently through 13 months of sightings was reported near the bridge in its final days is a question that depends almost entirely on what framework the person asking it brings to the evidence, and the record is honest enough not to supply the framework. It simply holds the timing, the accounts, the date, the location near the bridge, and the date of the collapse sit in proximity to each other in the historical record, without the record itself drawing the line between them. The 13 months between November 1966 and December 1967 are the chronological container the Mothman story lives in, and that container has a shape that is worth noticing even at a distance from any interpretive conclusion about what the sightings meant. The sequence opened with a specific documented, multiply-witnessed report from 4 credible adults who signed consistent statements with law enforcement the same night they had their experience. It accumulated, through the following weeks, a body of consistent supporting accounts from additional witnesses who had not coordinated with each other or with the Scarberries and Millettes. It found a careful, methodical chronicler in Mary Heyer, who was employed to pay attention and to write things down, and who had professional reasons to be careful about what she committed to paper. And it arrived, by December of 1967, at a geographic proximity to the bridge and to the event that closed that year in the most concrete and definitive possible way. The opening encounter, the November 15th account, has been described in more words than most Mothman-related accounts because it occupies a particular structural position in the record. It is the report that was made that same night, formally, to law enforcement by 4 named adults, in consistent detail, before the story had acquired any of the associations it would later carry. It is the cleanest data point in the sequence, the one least complicated by the overlay of legend, the one that had the simplest relationship to the apparatus of official record keeping. 4 people saw something. They described it consistently. They went to the sheriff's department and said so. A deputy wrote it down. The account has been revisited in interviews with the witnesses across the decades since, and the core description, the gray body, the folded wings, the red eyes, the strange efficiency of flight, has held its shape without significant variation. That particular quality of the account, the consistency of its details across time and across the memories of four separate people, is the thing that careful researchers have pointed at most often when noting what makes it different from the reports that followed. Mary Hyer's work through the period is worth holding separately from the other elements of the record for a specific reason. She was not a researcher with a prior investment in unusual phenomena. She was not a writer who had arrived in Point Pleasant with a thesis. She was a local correspondent with a beat, doing her job, which required her to take the incoming accounts seriously enough to document them carefully and skeptically enough to ask hard questions about their details. The notes she produced during those weeks were independent of the formal law enforcement record and independent of any subsequent analysis or publication. They were a working journalist's contemporaneous documentation of what people were reporting in the town where she worked, produced without any particular expectation of what they would eventually become. The fact that her notes corroborate, in their geography and their timing and their descriptive content, the formal record held by the sheriff's department is what gives them their particular evidentiary weight. Two independent lines of documentation, both careful, both produced by people with professional reasons to be skeptical, arriving at substantially the same picture of what was being reported in Mason County through those 13 months. The shape of the chronicle, when held at this distance, has an unusual coherence. Most bodies of unusual sighting reports are characterized by significant inconsistency in the core details, by a notable spread in the descriptions that witnesses offer, by the presence of obvious elaboration and exaggeration in some accounts that undermines confidence in the others. The Mothman record is not free of these problems. It is a collection of human accounts, and human accounts carry the full range of human limitations, but it has a core of consistency that runs from the first formally documented report through the accumulation of subsequent accounts in a way that made it harder for careful researchers to dismiss than the standard model of popular legend would suggest it should have been. The core description did not drift substantially. The core location remained stable. The core quality of the flight remained a consistent feature across accounts from witnesses who had not, by any available evidence, communicated with each other about what they had seen. The old concrete bunkers in the TNT area stood through all of it. They had stood through the wartime production years, the post-war abandonment, the gradual ecological reclamation of the surrounding land, the teenage Friday nights of the mid-1960s, and the months of 1966 and 1967 that would eventually become the period the town still remembered. The bunkers did not know any of this, of course. They were concrete, but they held their position in the landscape with the indifference of heavy, durable structures, and the scrub grew up around them, and the McClintock Wildlife Station managed the land they sat on, and the November nights continued to be cold and still and dark in the particular way of the Appalachian foothills in late autumn. What the months of accumulated sightings left behind, practically and physically, was paper, sheriff's department reports, Mary Hyer's notebooks, the newspaper accounts that ran first in the Point Pleasant Register and then in papers reached by the wire, statements signed by witnesses, the specific, careful words that ordinary people had found for an experience they did not have an existing vocabulary for, written down by deputies and journalists and recorded by the community's small institutional memory-keeping apparatus and filed. The filing cabinet that holds the Mason County record from that period contains the actual texture of what happened, not the interpretation, not the explanation, not the theory, but the record in its raw and specific form: names, dates, descriptions. The accumulation of a community's reported experience over 13 months. Roger Scarberry's description of driving at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour down a rural West Virginia road in November 1966 with something large and straight-lined maintaining its position above and behind the car without visible effort is still in the record. Linda Scarberry's description of the gray coloration is in the record. The description of the red eyes from all four witnesses, noted separately by the deputy who took their statements, is in the record. Mary Mallett's account of the wings is in the record. Steve Mallett's description of the speed is in the record. These are not second-hand accounts or later reconstructions. They are the words of four people who went to a law enforcement office the same night they had the experience, before any expectation about how the story should be told had time to form around them, and said what they had seen. The weeks of November that followed produced more paper. Each new account arrived with its own specificity: a different road, a different time of night, a different witness occupying a different point in the Mason County landscape, and landed on a desk, and was recorded, and was added to the file. The file grew in the steady, unremarkable way that official records grow, which is one page at a time, each page the record of a single person's single experience on a single occasion, the pages accumulating until the stack of them became a document of a different kind, a document not of any one encounter, but of a community's sustained encounter with something it did not have a name for yet. Mary Hyer's notes grew alongside the official record, parallel to it, neither confirming nor duplicating it, but constituting an independent line of documentation that would eventually be the primary source material for the research and writing that followed in the years after December 1967. She knew Point Pleasant. She knew its people. She knew which of her sources had been reliable over the years and which had not, and that knowledge shaped the weight she gave to different accounts. Her notebooks from that period were not a simple transcription of everything she was told. They were the product of a practiced journalistic judgment applied to an unusual and accumulating body of incoming reports, and that judgment is part of what makes the notes useful as evidence. She was sorting as she went. The final days of the 13-month sequence are the ones that carry the most subsequent interpretive weight, and the record treats them honestly, which is to say, it holds them in the same documentary register as everything that preceded them. The reports of the figure near the bridge in the days before December 15th exist in the record as they exist in the record, as accounts, logged, described, placed in their geographic context. What surrounds them in the archive is the same kind of document that had been accumulating for 13 months: a name, a date, a location, a description, the careful notation of a deputy or a journalist who had been recording accounts of this kind long enough to know what the standard description contained, and to note what the new account added to it or diverged from it. These final reports were not treated differently in real time than the ones that had preceded them. They were simply the most recent entries in a file that had been growing for 13 months. The stack of accounts, the independent journalist's notes, the deputy's careful handwriting on those county report forms, all of it accumulated through those months, and then, on December 15th, the world that the record was part of changed in a specific, irreversible, and enormous way, and the accounts that preceded the change acquired the particular quality of things that existed before, an event that could not have been anticipated, and therefore could not have been planned for. the record had been made in the ordinary forward-moving way without knowledge of what was coming. It sat, afterward, as a record of the period that preceded the disaster, a document of the 13 months before the bridge came down, a quiet archive of a community's experience of something it had not resolved and was not going to resolve, held in the careful, ordinary format of official report and journalists' notes in a river town in West Virginia. The 4 Scarberry and Millette statements, filed on the night of November 15th, are the first page of that archive. The accounts from the final days of December 1967, placed near the bridge in description, are among its last. Between those points lies the accumulated paper of a chronicle that has not been fully explained, and that has been sitting in its file, patient and specific, for more than half a century, with the same red eyes and the same gray wings and the same straight-line efficiency of flight across every page. The Silver Bridge stood at the edge of Point Pleasant for 39 years before anyone had reason to think carefully about what held it up. On any ordinary morning in those decades, a driver crossing from the West Virginia side toward Gallipolis, Ohio, would have felt the familiar mild vibration of steel mesh underfoot, heard the particular low hum a bridge makes when traffic passes over it in the cold, and looked up, perhaps, at the aluminum-painted chains rising toward the towers, bright against whatever sky the Ohio Valley was offering that day. The river below was always present, gray-green and wide and moving at its own pace, neither welcoming nor threatening, simply there as it had been for a very long time before the bridge, and would be for a very long time after. The Silver Bridge was the kind of structure that becomes part of the background of a life. It was used every day by people who had stopped seeing it, the way a person stops seeing a door they open 100 times a year, because the door has become ordinary, and ordinary things make themselves invisible. The bridge had earned its popular name from the color of the paint on its suspension chains. Aluminum paint, applied in the late 1920s when the structure was completed, gave the spans a pale metallic sheen that caught the light differently than iron-painted bridges, a quality the Ohio Valley residents noticed and named without ceremony. People who grew up near Point Pleasant in the 1930s and 1940s remembered the bridge as simply part of the landscape of their childhood. The silver thing at the edge of the river, as familiar and unremarkable as the hills. Its technical name, the Silver Bridge, appeared on official documents, but it was the same name people used naturally, because the color was genuinely the bridge's most visible characteristic, the thing that made it distinctive against the particular quality of Ohio River light on clear mornings. The bridge was completed in 1928, and it represented something real in the history of American bridge engineering. It was among the first bridges in the country to use an I-bar chain suspension system rather than the wire cable systems that had become standard since the late 19th century. An I-bar suspension chain is exactly what it sounds like, a series of elongated steel bars, each one a flattened oval with a hole at each end, linked together through those holes with large steel pins. The bars carry their loads in tension, pulling against one another along the length of the chain rather than compressing downward. It was a method that had worked well in certain European applications, and in 1928, the engineers who built the Silver Bridge regarded the design as a reasonable and sound approach to spanning the 700-foot main channel of the Ohio River at that location. The chain links were large, carefully machined from high-strength steel, and the whole system was designed to carry the loads that traffic in the late 1920s would place on it. Those loads, in 1928, were considerably lighter than what a bridge at that location would eventually be asked to carry. The 1930s brought heavier vehicles. The 1940s brought more traffic and heavier vehicles still. By the 1950s, the Ohio Valley economy was active, and the bridge at Point Pleasant was carrying loads across its aluminum painted spans that would have been difficult to anticipate when the original engineers drew their calculations in the mid 1920s. The bridge was not failing. It was performing adequately, carrying its traffic, making its low hum, standing at the edge of the town in the way that familiar structures stand, which is to say, without drawing attention to themselves. There was no obvious sign of distress. There was nothing visible from the road surface, from the pedestrian walkway, from a boat on the river below that would have told an observer anything was accumulating inside the steel. What was accumulating was a crack. Deep in the steel of one particular eye-bar, the bar designated in engineering records as eye-bar 330, located in the north suspension chain on the Ohio side of the main span, a process called stress corrosion cracking had been developing slowly over years. Stress corrosion cracking is what happens when a metal under sustained tensile load is also exposed over a long period to a corrosive environment. The metal does not simply rust, it fractures from within along crystalline boundaries in ways that are often invisible at the surface and that propagate with a slowness that makes them very difficult to detect during routine inspection. The crack in I-bar 330 had been growing inside the steel for a long time. It grew without announcement. It grew during the years when the bridge was carrying its ordinary traffic, during the years when the aluminum paint was being touched up, during the years when the Ohio Valley residents who crossed the bridge every day were going about their lives with no reason to think about what was inside the chain links above their heads. The I-bar chain system carried a specific engineering vulnerability that wire cable bridges did not share, and that vulnerability lay in what engineers call redundancy, or in this case, the complete absence of it. A wire cable suspension bridge carries its loads through thousands of individual wires bundled together. If a single wire fails, corrodes through, snaps under load, the remaining thousands of wires absorb the lost contribution without catastrophic consequence. The system is redundant by design. The failure of one component is absorbed by the collective capacity of all the others, and the failure can be detected over time and addressed. An I-bar chain works differently. Each link is a single discrete steel bar. There is no bundle, no collective, no distribution across thousands of simultaneous load paths. Each bar either holds or it does not. And when I-bar 330 had cracked far enough through its cross-section that the remaining steel could no longer carry the tensile load the bridge placed on it, the transfer of that load to adjacent components was not gradual, it was instantaneous. The adjacent components were not designed to absorb that instantaneous additional load. December 15th, 1967 was a Friday afternoon. In Point Pleasant and in Gallipolis, Ohio, on the far bank, the particular business of a Friday before Christmas was underway. The downtown shops were open, and people were moving between them with the purposeful mild urgency of holiday shopping. A Friday afternoon in mid-December carries a specific quality in small Ohio Valley towns in that era. The week's work, either finished or nearly so, the weekend just ahead, the Christmas holiday 2 weeks away, and therefore still present as something to attend to rather than something already upon them. The traffic crossing the Silver Bridge at that hour was the traffic of a working Friday, heavier than a Tuesday midday, lighter than a Saturday, made up of the ordinary mixture of personal vehicles, delivery trucks, and the regular commerce of a river crossing that served 2 states. The bridge collapsed at approximately 5 minutes past 5 o'clock in the afternoon. 46 people died. They came from both sides of the river, from Point Pleasant and Mason County and the surrounding rural townships of West Virginia, and from Gallipolis and the Ohio communities that used the crossing regularly. They were men and women and children. Some were in vehicles that went directly into the Ohio River when the span failed. Some were pulled under by the weight of the falling structure. The Ohio River in December is cold in a way that leaves very little time for survival, and the debris of a collapsing bridge is not a situation from which most people could escape under any circumstances. The river received what fell into it and continued moving, as rivers do. The collapse was witnessed from both banks. People standing near the water, people on the bridge approaches, people in buildings along the Ohio River in Gallipolis saw the spans go. Eyewitness descriptions from the first minutes describe a sound that some compared to a sharp metallic crack, followed almost immediately by the sustained noise of the structure failing, steel and concrete, and cables, and the vehicles that had been on the bridge, all entering the water in a matter of seconds. The bridge that had stood at the edge of Point Pleasant for 39 years ceased to exist in a very short time. What remained in the river were fragments of what it had been, sections of chain, pieces of roadway, the shapes of vehicles submerged in the December water, and on both banks, the abrupt absence where a familiar structure had been that morning. The rescue and recovery operations began within hours and continued for days in conditions that were difficult by any measure. The Ohio River in December does not cooperate with diving operations. The debris field was extensive. The cold made everything harder and made survival in the water a question that resolved itself quickly and badly for the people who had gone in with the bridge. The 46 who died were recovered over the days and weeks that followed. One person was never found. The town of Point Pleasant, which had been a place of approximately 6,000 people, with a close-knit social fabric built on familiarity and shared history, had lost 46 of its neighbors, family members, and friends in a single Friday afternoon. The National Bureau of Standards conducted the engineering investigation into the cause of the collapse. The investigators worked methodically through the debris field, recovering and cataloging the structural components that had been pulled from the river, examining the fracture surfaces of the steel, and reconstructing the sequence of events that had led from a single failing component to the complete loss of the bridge in seconds. The work was painstaking and took years. The final report, issued in 1971, reached conclusions that were specific and verifiable, and could be stated with a high degree of engineering confidence. I-bar 330 had failed due to stress corrosion cracking. The crack had been developing inside the steel for years. It had been invisible from any external inspection, not because inspectors had failed in their duties, but because the crack was internal to the metal and produced no surface indication that would have been detectable by the inspection methods available at the time. When the crack grew to the point that the remaining steel cross-section could no longer sustain the tensile load the bridge placed on it, the I-bar fractured. The load transferred instantaneously to adjacent chain links that were not engineered to absorb it. The progressive failure of the chain propagated faster than any human response could have addressed, and the span came down. The I-bar chain design's lack of redundancy was the central engineering lesson the investigation identified. A single internal crack in a single component, of the kind that can accumulate in high-strength steel under the combined action of sustained tension and a mildly corrosive environment, was sufficient to initiate the failure of the entire structure. There was no secondary load path, no distribution system, no means by which the load could be redirected while the failing component was identified and addressed. The design worked until the moment it did not work, and at that moment it failed completely. The investigators also noted that the high-strength steel used in the eye bars was more susceptible to stress corrosion cracking than the lower-strength steels used in wire cable bridges. This was not a defect in the original fabrication. The steel had been produced to the specifications of its time and had met those specifications. The susceptibility of high-strength steels to this particular failure mode was not fully understood in 1928 in the way it would come to be understood over the following decades. The engineers who designed the Silver Bridge were working with the knowledge available to them, and what they built stood for 39 years. What the investigation established was that the knowledge available in 1928 was not sufficient to anticipate a failure mode that would develop silently over 3 decades and make itself known in a single afternoon in December. The Congress of the United States, responding to the Silver Bridge disaster and to the questions it raised about the condition of similar structures elsewhere in the country, passed legislation requiring systematic federal inspection of the nation's bridges on a regular cycle. Before December 1967, bridge inspection in the United States was largely a matter of state and local responsibility, with no uniform national standard for frequency, method, or reporting. The Silver Bridge collapse established, in a way that could not be ignored, that bridges are structures that age in ways that are not always visible, that the loads they carry over decades may differ substantially from the loads their designers anticipated, and that the absence of an observable problem is not the same as the absence of a problem. In the years following the passage of the federal bridge inspection legislation, inspectors working under the new requirements identified hundreds of structurally deficient bridges across the country, structures that had been in service, carrying their daily traffic, offering no obvious sign of difficulty, while accumulating the kind of internal deterioration that had destroyed the Silver Bridge. Some of those bridges were repaired, some were replaced, some were closed. The policy change that came out of the Point Pleasant disaster reached every state in the country and continued to shape bridge engineering and inspection practice in the decades that followed. The number 46 appears in the engineering records as a casualty figure, a datum in the report, and it is worth holding for a moment as what it actually represents: 46 specific people who crossed the Silver Bridge on a Friday afternoon in December and did not cross back. They were residents of the Ohio Valley, people with ordinary Friday plans, people with the holiday ahead of them and the working week behind them, people who had crossed that bridge dozens or hundreds of times before without incident, because dozens or hundreds of times before the crack in I-bar 330 had not yet reached the size at which the remaining steel could no longer hold. The 46th crossing was the same crossing they had made every time, from the perspective of everyone involved. The bridge looked the same. The river looked the same. The Friday afternoon looked the same. The aluminum-painted chains had been bright against the Ohio Valley sky for 39 years. The investigation's technical diagrams, published in the 1971 report, show I-bar 330 in its precise location in the chain, mark the origin point of the stress corrosion crack with the kind of careful notation that engineering reports use, and trace the line of fracture propagation through the bar's cross-section. The language is measured and exact, as engineering language is designed to be. It does not dwell on what happened to the people on the bridge when the span failed. That is not what an engineering report is for. The engineering report establishes cause and offers recommendations, and in this case the recommendations were adopted nationally, and the bridges identified under the new inspection program were addressed. The report is a document that converted a specific irreversible tragedy into a set of findings that changed how bridges are built and maintained across the country. That is what the report could do. It could not do more than that. In Point Pleasant, the Ohio River continued to move between its banks through the winter of 1967 and 1968, carrying its gray-green current past the debris field and the recovery operations, and then past the cleared site where a temporary ferry crossing was established to replace what the bridge had provided. The town attended to its grief in the way that small, close-knit communities attend to grief, collectively, in churches, in the practical mutual support of people who know each other's names and histories, in the slow, difficult work of continuing. The families of the 46 were neighbors of the people who had not been on the bridge that afternoon. There was no distance in a town of 6,000 people between those who had lost someone and those who had not. Everyone knew who was gone. The Silver Memorial Bridge was completed and opened to traffic in 1969. It spans the Ohio River at Point Pleasant on the same crossing the Silver Bridge had served, carrying vehicles from the West Virginia Bank to the Ohio Bank and back, as the structure it replaced had done for nearly 4 decades. The new bridge was built using different engineering principles, a conventional wire cable suspension design, with the redundancy that the I-bar chain system had lacked, and it was built under inspection protocols that reflected what the investigation into the old bridge's collapse had established. It is a functional structure, doing the same work its predecessor did. Drivers cross it on ordinary days without thinking about what preceded it at that location, because that is what ordinary daily crossings become over time, unremarkable in the way that all familiar things become unremarkable. The Ohio River below the Silver Memorial Bridge moves in the same direction it has always moved, from east to west, carrying the water of the Appalachian watershed toward the Mississippi and eventually to the Gulf. It does not move any differently than it moved on the afternoon of December 15th, 1967, or on any afternoon in the years before the Silver Bridge was built. The river predates the bridge by a very long time. It will persist long after the current crossing has been replaced by whatever comes next. The West Virginia hills on the far bank from Gallipolis are the same hills they have always been. They are visible from the Ohio Bank on clear days, rising above the river floodplain in the particular low green layering of Appalachian Ridge and Hollow, their profile unchanging across the seasons in any way that a person making a single crossing would notice. They stood behind the Silver Bridge. They stand behind the Silver Memorial Bridge. Whatever question a person brings to that view, the engineering question, the historical question, the quieter and harder question of what it means that 46 people who crossed in the ordinary way on an ordinary Friday did not come back. The hills hold the same shape regardless. What the investigation established, taken all together and held as a set of verifiable findings, is this: a bridge can fail from within, from a crack that accumulates across years in a single component, invisible to any inspection method available at the time, giving no surface warning, offering no gradual sign of distress that would allow an intervention before the threshold is reached. The Silver Bridge held its traffic for 39 years, and in the 39th year, on a December afternoon, the internal process that had been running quietly through one steel bar reached the point of no further capacity, and the bridge came down in seconds. The investigation also established that this was not an anomaly specific to the Silver Bridge. The I-bar chain design was used in a small number of other American bridges of the same era, and those bridges were examined after 1967 With the findings of the Silver Bridge investigation in hand, the knowledge produced by the collapse was applied, and applied specifically to the structures that shared the vulnerability the investigation had identified. This is what engineering investigations do. The knowledge is extracted from the failure and used to prevent subsequent failures of the same kind. That process is slow and technical and unglamorous, and it is the most honest way available to respond to a structural disaster. Point Pleasant still stands at the confluence of the Kanawha and Ohio rivers in Mason County, West Virginia, as it has stood since its founding. Its population in the decades since the disaster has remained in the range of what it was in 1966, a small river town with the history it has accumulated across the years, the 1774 battle that some historians regard as the opening engagement of the Revolutionary War, the wartime munitions production that left its concrete bunkers standing in the fields north of town, the 13 months of accounts and reports that preceded December 1967, and the Friday afternoon in December when the bridge came down. All of these are part of the same place. They exist in the same landscape, pressed into the same ground, present in the memory of the same community. The town erected a memorial to those who died on December 15, 1967. It stands in Point Pleasant as memorials stand in small towns, as a fixed point in the landscape that the people who live nearby know how to hold, that visitors encounter with the particular quietness that material remembrance produces, that the passing years weather without erasing. The 46 names are on it. The names are specific. They are the specific names of specific people who crossed the Silver Bridge on a specific Friday afternoon, and the memorial holds that specificity as firmly as stone and metal can hold anything. The Silver Memorial Bridge carries its traffic across the Ohio River on ordinary days in the present, unremarked upon by most of the people crossing it, which is as it should be. A bridge that is doing its work well is a bridge that is not thought about. The cars and trucks move across the river in both directions. The Ohio Valley goes about its business, and the water below the bridge moves westward in the same direction it has always moved, at the same patient pace, toward the same distant confluence it has been moving toward since long before there was anyone on either bank to name it. The 1971 federal report sits in its archives, its technical language, and its diagrams, and its casualty figure intact. IBAR 330 is identified precisely in it. The crack is described precisely. The failure sequence is traced with the care that engineers bring to the reconstruction of something that went wrong, so that it does not go wrong again in the same way. The policy changes the report prompted are still in effect. The inspections they required have continued. The bridges they identified as deficient were addressed over the decades that followed the legislation's passage, and the record of those inspections is itself a large and patient document accumulated across the country over more than 50 years. What the record cannot fully carry is the specific ordinary weight of a Friday afternoon in December, the particular temperature of the air, the particular quality of the light on the aluminum painted chains in the minutes before 5 o'clock, the specific routes of the 46 people who were on the bridge at that moment, and the specific ordinary reasons they had for crossing it then. Those details are not in any engineering report. They exist, to the extent they exist at all, in the memories of the people who knew the 46, and in the quieter knowledge that a small town carries in its collective life across the years, present in the way that the things a community has lived through are always present, settling over time into the ground of a place, the way that everything eventually settles, not forgotten, not resolved, simply held. The Ohio River on a December afternoon is the color of the sky reflected through cold water. It carries no record of what has happened at any point along its length. It simply moves as it has always moved between its banks and through its valley, past Point Pleasant and past the West Virginia hills, and onward, steadily and without urgency toward the west. John Keel arrived in Point Pleasant, West Virginia in the spring of 1967, carrying a journalist's notebook and a working assumption that the things people were describing in this part of the Ohio Valley were not going to fit into any category he already had. He had driven from New York. The town was smaller than he expected, or perhaps exactly as small as he had expected. The way towns described to you in advance still managed to be quieter and more ordinary than the description prepared you for. He stepped out of his car somewhere near the center of town and stood for a moment in the particular air of a West Virginia river valley, cool, green-smelling, carrying the faint mineral undertone of the two rivers that met at the edge of everything here. And then he opened his notebook and began. He was 36 years old. He had already spent a decade writing about things that official categories tended to resist: aerial phenomena, anomalous events, the particular class of reported encounters that accumulated in the margins of the news and were regularly dismissed without being examined. His 1966 book had argued against the prevailing current of popular UFO research that the phenomena being reported across the country were not spacecraft from other solar systems, but something considerably harder to name, something that had been present in human experience for a very long time, wearing different shapes in different centuries, and that the label of extraterrestrial visitor was simply the current era's preferred misidentification. He had come to Point Pleasant because the reports were unusually concentrated, unusually consistent, and unusually well documented for something that had no agreed-upon explanation. Mary Heyer had been documenting them since November. She was the Point Pleasant correspondent for The Messenger, a newspaper based across the river in Athens, Ohio, and she had been taking calls from witnesses since the night the Scarberry and Millette families had walked into the Mason County Sheriff's Department and given their statements. Her notes were handwritten on the kind of paper a working regional journalist uses, nothing archival, nothing formal, and they had been filling a particular drawer of her desk at a rate that surprised her. She had not set out to compile a record of anything. She had set out to file stories, which is what journalists do, and the stories had kept arriving with a consistency that made the drawer heavier each week. What Keel found when he met her was something a researcher rarely finds: a contemporaneous record, compiled independently by someone with no theoretical stake in what the record showed. Heyer had not been trying to prove anything. She had been trying to document what people were reporting, which is a different activity, and the distinction matters. Her notes did not argue for a conclusion. They simply accumulated names, dates, locations, descriptions of a gray figure with folded wings and eyes that several dozen separate witnesses, who had not spoken to one another before calling the newspaper, described in nearly the same words. Keel began his own interviews. He worked through the spring and into the summer of that year, driving the rural roads north of town toward the old munitions grounds, sitting across from witnesses in their homes, writing down what they told him. The notebook filled. A second notebook began to fill. The details held a consistency that made casual dismissal difficult, not because any single account was beyond question, but because the accounts had been gathered independently at different times from people with no evident motive to coordinate, and they kept describing the same thing: the same gray color, the same enormous folded wings, the same straight-line flight, level and unhurried, Not the arching path of a bird working updrafts, but something more direct, as though the thing had somewhere specific to be, and the air between it and that destination was simply not a problem. He was a careful note taker. That matters to the shape of what survived. Investigations of unusual events are often reconstructed after the fact from memory, which is a medium that has well documented and considerable limitations, particularly across years and decades. What Keel produced was a record compiled close to the source, in the months when the witnesses' accounts were still fresh, and the details were still specific, and the emotional texture of the thing they had seen was still near enough to the surface to come through in conversation. Some of what he gathered was confirmable through other means: the sheriff's department records, high-res independent files, the dated accounts in the local press. Some of it rested on his notes alone. The distinction is worth holding clearly, which Keel himself did not always do consistently, but the core of the record, the documented, multiply-witnessed sightings from November and December of 1966, sits in sources that exist independently of any one researcher's interpretation. The TNT area was quieter by the time he arrived than it had been in the peak months of the sighting reports. The old munitions grounds north of Point Pleasant had drawn attention from all directions in November and December of the previous year. Witnesses, curiosity seekers, journalists with cameras, the sheriff's deputies who had followed up on the reports with varying degrees of seriousness. By spring, the immediate wave had settled. The concrete bunkers stood where they had always stood, half consumed by 2 decades of undergrowth, their thick curved walls retaining the particular cool mineral air that concrete keeps, regardless of what season surrounds it. The roads through the old facility were still there, still overgrown at the edges, the asphalt broken in places by tree roots that had had since 1945 to work their way through the surface. Wildlife had long since reclaimed most of it. The area had been designated the McClintock Wildlife Station after the federal government decommissioned the facility, and whatever the bunkers had once held, they held nothing now but darkness and cool air, and the small particular sounds of a wooded landscape going about its patient business. Keel walked it. He drove it. He tried to understand what the landscape would have looked and felt like to people who knew it well and to people who were encountering it for the first time at night, when the headlights of a car would have reached only a short distance into the surrounding dark, and the shapes of the bunkers would have emerged from the tree line in an order that was disconcerting even to the most rationally inclined observer. The geometry of the old facility was not straightforward. The roads did not follow obvious logic. A person who had grown up in Point Pleasant would have known the layout from years of informal use. The area had been a destination for teenagers and families, and curious locals long before the sightings gave it a different kind of reputation. But even familiarity did not entirely tame the way the place felt at night, when the trees pressed in close and the concrete shapes rose from the vegetation at intervals that the darkness made hard to predict. He spent the better part of a year in and around Point Pleasant. He left, returned, left again. The town's population of approximately 6,000 was the kind of social fabric in which news and experience moved quickly, not through any single channel, but through the overlapping networks of churches and schools and workplaces and long-term neighbor relationships that characterize a close-knit rural community. People knew each other. When someone had an experience they could not explain, the people they told it to were people who knew their character, their habits, their general reliability. The social context of the accounts mattered to their reception. A report from a stranger can be easily filed under the general heading of unreliable narration. a report from someone whose family has lived 2 streets over for 30 years, someone whose judgment the listener has had occasion to assess across decades of ordinary interaction, is a different kind of claim. This was part of what Keel was attempting to understand, not just what the witnesses had seen, but what the texture of the community that surrounded the sightings could tell him about the reliability and independence of the accounts. What he found was not a community primed for collective hallucination or suggestible to the point of manufacturing consistent false reports. What he found was a community that was, in the main, quietly unsettled, doing what people in close-knit small towns do with experiences they cannot categorize, talking about it carefully, mostly among people they trusted, and waiting for something to resolve the uncertainty. The resolution that came in December of 1967 was nothing anyone had been waiting for. After the Silver Bridge collapsed on the evening of December 15th, the character of the preceding 13 months changed in the town's collective memory. It changed because that is what human memory does with sequences of events once a terminal and traumatic event arrives. It reorganizes everything that came before in the new light of what came after. The sightings had been strange and unresolved for 13 months. After December 15th, they became something people looked back through toward a loss that was specific and real and permanent. 46 people, most of them had been making ordinary crossings of an ordinary Friday before the holiday shopping season, and the river had been cold, and the December evening had been dark early, the way December evenings are in the Ohio Valley. Keel continued his work. He was gathering material that would eventually become a book, though the book was still years away at this point. The notes accumulated, the tapes of interviews accumulated, the correspondence with Mary Heyer accumulated, her letters arriving at his New York address with the particular compressed detail of a working journalist writing to a colleague, efficient, specific, organized around what had happened and what she had confirmed and what remained unclear. They worked in parallel, at a distance, across the months that followed the disaster, each maintaining a record that the other's record could, in some important instances, corroborate. Heyer continued filing her correspondence and her notes long after the immediate attention of the outside world had moved on. She was a local journalist, which meant the story of Point Pleasant was not a story she could leave. She lived there. She would continue living there. The community that had been through the 13 months of sightings and then through the bridge collapse was the community she covered, which meant she covered its grief and its recovery and its long gradual process of reorganizing itself around what it had lost. Her notes from this period are a different kind of record than the witness interview notes, less dramatic in the content they document, perhaps, but no less carefully maintained, and in some respects more valuable, because they capture the duration of the aftermath rather than just its peak. Keel published The Mothman Prophecies in 1975. The book found a modest audience initially, not a large commercial success in its first years, but the kind of book that locates its readers through informal networks of recommendation, passed from one person to another, among people who found themselves drawn to questions that formal institutions tended not to engage. Over the following decades, it accumulated a readership that grew gradually, not in the rapid curve of a bestseller, but in the slow, organic spread of a book that kept finding people who needed it. By the 1980s, it had developed what could fairly be called a cult following, and the term is not pejorative in this context. It describes a genuinely devoted readership that had found in the book something that other available frameworks for thinking about unusual events did not provide. The book was not a straightforward account of documented sightings. Keel was not a straightforward writer in that sense, which has always been both its strength and the source of much of the critical difficulty it presents to a reader trying to use it as a primary source. He wove his own theoretical framework through the witness testimony and the documentary record in a way that made it difficult, at times, to distinguish between what the evidence showed and what Keel proposed the evidence implied. His concept of ultra-terrestrials, entities he argued were not visitors from other planets, but beings that had shared the Earth with humanity across the full span of human history, operating in a dimension or frequency of reality that intersected with ordinary human experience only under specific and poorly understood conditions, was presented with a confidence that the underlying evidence did not always support. It was a theoretical framework. It deserved to be received as one. Some of his readers received it exactly as he presented it, which is to say, as established truth, and the distinction between Keel's interpretation and Keel's evidence has required some untangling in the decades since. What the evidence actually showed, the documented core of it, stripped of the theoretical scaffolding, was more modest and in its own way more durable. Several dozen people across the Ohio Valley, during a concentrated 13-month period, reported encounters with a large gray figure with folded wings and self-luminous red eyes. Their accounts were gathered independently. They did not coordinate. The descriptions they produced were consistent in the specific details, consistent enough to be noted carefully, even by researchers who approached the material with considerable skepticism and who were, on the whole, looking for the inconsistencies that would allow them to resolve the accounts through ordinary means. The consistency was not total. Memory varies, perception varies, and people do not see identical events identically even when they are standing in the same place at the same moment. But the core details held in a way that was worth noting. The Scarberry and Millette accounts are the best documented because they are the most multiply witnessed and the most formally recorded. 4 people, 2 married couples. They gave their statements to the Mason County Sheriff's Department on the same night as the encounter, separately, and the statements were consistent. They were interviewed many times in the years that followed, by Keel, by other researchers, by journalists revisiting the story as it accumulated history, and the accounts they gave in those later interviews were consistent with the accounts they had given in the immediate aftermath. The creature's gray coloration, the folded wings, the straight-line flight, keeping pace with a vehicle traveling at speed, without the effortful wing beats of a large bird working to maintain elevation, something more like a fixed trajectory maintained without apparent expenditure. The specific location near the generator building in the old munitions grounds north of Point Pleasant. Details shift across time and memory. That is well established, and it is the primary mechanism through which skeptical analysis of eyewitness accounts typically operates, finding the points where memory has drifted from the original report, the places where later knowledge has been retroactively inserted into an earlier experience. These are real mechanisms. They apply to all eyewitness testimony, including this. What makes the Scarberry Mallet accounts persistently resistant to this form of analysis is not that the witnesses are immune to memory drift, no one is, but that the core details have held across interviews, spanning decades without the significant variation that memory drift typically produces. The color, the wings, the flight path, the red eyes, the location, these elements have remained stable in the accounts of all 4 witnesses across a span of time long enough that instability would have been expected and would, if present, have been detectable. There is no resolution to offer here. The document of what happened in the 13 months between November 1966 and December 1967 in Point Pleasant and the surrounding Ohio Valley exists. It is a real record. Multiple witnesses, multiple accounts, formal documentation in the form of Sheriff's Department statements, independent journalistic notes compiled by a working local reporter with no theoretical agenda. A book published 8 years after the events by a researcher who had been on the ground during the period in question. The record is not going to resolve into a clean explanation because it has not done so across the 6 decades since the events it documents, and the reasons for that persistence of uncertainty are not simply that no one has looked carefully enough. People have looked carefully. The record persists in its current open form. What the town of Point Pleasant made of all of it across the decades that followed is its own kind of document. The town continued. That sounds like a simple thing to say, but it is not a small thing. A community that has lost 46 of its members in a sudden and traumatic event, that has lived through a 13-month period of widely reported encounters no one could explain, that found itself for a time at the center of national news coverage for reasons both tragic and strange. Such a community might reasonably have developed a complicated relationship with its own recent history. Point Pleasant did not pretend the history away. It did not, on the other hand, reduce itself to it. The town held its unusual history with the same quiet, steady civic pride with which it had always held its older history. The 1774 battle at the confluence, the place where two rivers met and a particular kind of American settlement had taken root. The Mothman became part of the local story without displacing the other parts. A statue was eventually erected in the town, a metallic figure with folded wings standing in the center of the downtown area, a piece of civic art that is photographed by visitors and walked past by residents, incorporated into the ordinary furniture of the streetscape, the way the 1774 monument had been incorporated long before. There is an annual festival. There is a small museum. The town has organized its unusual history into something livable, something that can be acknowledged and engaged, and then set down again at the end of the day when the ordinary business of a small river town resumes. That process of integration, the way a community absorbs an unusual event into its ongoing life without either suppressing it or being consumed by it, is its own kind of testimony. The people who were in Point Pleasant during the 13 months of the sightings are older now, and some of them are gone. The people who lost family members in the bridge collapse have had more than 50 years to live with that loss. The town's relationship to its own history is not a simple one, but it is a working one, which is about as much as can be asked of any community that has lived through events of this particular character. The book found its widest audience eventually through a 2002 film adaptation starring Richard Gere that introduced the name Point Pleasant, West Virginia, to an audience that numbered in the millions and had, for the most part, never heard of the town or its history. The film was not a documentary. It was a dramatic interpretation of Keel's book, itself a dramatic interpretation of the events, and the distance between the film and the documented historical record was considerable. But the effect of the film on the town's place and popular awareness was substantial. People who had seen the film began arriving in Point Pleasant, curious visitors, researchers, people with cameras, people who had simply wanted to stand in the place where the story had happened. The town was real. The confluence of the rivers was real. The old munitions grounds north of town were real. The concrete bunkers were still standing. They are still standing now. The McClintock Wildlife Station goes about its work in the overgrown fields and the re-established woodland that surrounds what remains of the old wartime facility. The station manages the land for the benefit of the animals that live there, migratory birds that use the area as a waypoint on their seasonal routes, white-tailed deer moving through the scrub growth between the bunkers, the ordinary population of a mid-Atlantic woodland ecosystem, going about the business of feeding and sheltering and reproducing that woodland ecosystems go about regardless of what the surrounding human history has been. The concrete bunkers are obstacles around which the land has organized itself. Their walls are thick enough that the interior temperature stays cool through the summer and mild through the winter, and things shelter in them, the small, patient kinds of things that find use in a structure that no longer has a human purpose. The bunkers themselves are architecturally straightforward, thick, curved concrete walls poured in the early 1940s by workers who were building storage capacity for a wartime production facility as quickly as the project required. The concrete is old now, not ancient in any geological sense, barely 80 years, which is nothing at all measured against the age of the landscape around it, but old enough that the surface has taken on the particular weathered texture of concrete that has been through many cycles of heat and cold and wet and dry. The roots of trees have worked under the edges of some of them. Vines have moved across the exteriors in the patient decades since anyone last cared about maintaining the surfaces. The bunkers do not look like ruins exactly because they are not ruined. The walls are intact. The structural integrity is largely preserved. They are simply no longer used for the purpose they were built to serve. And the landscape has treated that vacancy as an invitation. Keel's notes are in archives. Hyries' notes, to whatever extent they have been preserved, are part of the historical record of this 13-month period. The Sheriff's Department's statements from November 1966 are documents that exist or existed in the county records where they were filed. The witness accounts have been repeated in interviews that were recorded on tape, transcribed onto paper, published in books and articles, and documentary treatments across the decades. The record does not diminish over time in the way that purely oral traditions diminish. It has been committed to forms that persist: paper, tape, published print, and now the various digital formats in which it continues to circulate, finding new readers who encounter the story of Point Pleasant for the first time and begin from wherever they are in the world to learn about the confluence of two rivers at the edge of a small West Virginia town in the 13 months that preceded December 1967. The four witnesses from November 15, 1966, gave their accounts again and again across the years that followed. Not obsessively, they had lives, ordinary lives in the Ohio Valley, and the encounter in the TNT area was one event among the many that composed those lives. But they were asked, and they answered, and the answer did not change in its essential shape. The gray color of the figure, the size of the wings, the way the flight did not look like anything they had a name for, the red eyes, the road north of Point Pleasant at night, the headlights cutting a short path into the dark, the car moving faster than it had reason to be moving, and somewhere in the air behind it, something keeping pace that had no obvious reason to be doing so, and was doing so anyway. The open quality of the record, the fact that it has not resolved, that the question it raises sits in the same unanswered state it occupied in 1966, that 6 decades of interest and investigation have not produced the closing document that would allow the account to be filed under a settled heading, is not necessarily a problem. Questions that remain open across decades often do so because the available evidence is genuinely insufficient to close them, not because the truth is being hidden or the investigation is being conducted poorly. The Mothman record is open because what the evidence shows is limited, that several dozen people in a specific part of West Virginia reported a specific class of encounter during a specific 13-month period, that their accounts were consistent in particular details, and that no subsequent investigation has produced a definitive explanation of what they were seeing. The question of what they were seeing remains available, which is perhaps the most precise way to describe its current status. The TNT area is still there. The McClintock Wildlife Station's birds are going through their seasonal movements, arriving in spring from wherever they have been, departing in autumn toward wherever they are going. The whole unhurried rhythm of a migratory population using a piece of West Virginia wetland and scrub as a waypoint in a journey that takes no notice of what the land was once used for or what the land is now known for. The deer move in the early morning and the late evening when the light is low, as deer do, stepping through the long grass at the edges of the old facility roads, with the particular careful alertness that deer carry through all their waking hours. The bunkers stand in the vegetation, their walls cool and patient and indifferent to the season, on an ordinary morning in the present, with the light coming in low through the tree canopy, and the dew still on the grass, and the birds already at work in the branches overhead. The old munitions grounds have the quality of a place that has settled deeply into its current purpose and its current silence. The wartime urgency that built it is 70 years gone. The 13 months that gave it a different kind of attention are more than 50 years gone. What remains is the land itself, and the structures the land has half reclaimed, and the animals that have found in that reclamation, the particular combination of open water and sheltered cover and undisturbed woodland that constitutes a good place to be. If a bird or a deer or a small patient creature of the undergrowth is what you are. The questions about what moved through this landscape in the autumn and winter of 1966 rest quietly in the historical record alongside the documents that describe it. The Sheriff's Department statements, the journalist's notes, the published accounts, the interview tapes. They are not urgent questions at this distance. They are the kind of questions that a person can hold without discomfort, turning them over gently, finding them interesting without finding them pressing. The people who saw what they saw have described it as fully as memory and language permitted. The record of what they described exists. The explanation that would settle the record into a known category has not arrived, and the absence of that explanation has not in 6 decades been filled by anything more satisfying than continued open inquiry. Point Pleasant stands at the confluence of the Kanawha and the Ohio rivers, as it has always stood.